kind of mind wants total control over millions of people? Why do some leaders become obsessed with power, silence criticism, punish disobedience, and slowly turn into tyrants? Dictators are often described as monsters, but that explanation is too easy. The more disturbing truth is this: most dictators do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as necessary, as saviors, as protectors, as the only person strong enough to bring order to chaos. And that is what makes them dangerous. Because the psychology of dictators is not just about cruelty. It is about fear, ego, paranoia, insecurity, and an endless hunger for control. In this video, we'll break down the psychology behind dictators, why absolute power changes the human mind, and how ordinary people can end up worshiping dangerous leaders. Part 1. Dictators are driven by control. At the center of nearly every dictatorship is one obsession: control. Not just political control, psychological control, social control, emotional control, even control over truth itself. A dictator cannot tolerate uncertainty. They cannot tolerate resistance. And most of all, they cannot tolerate the idea that they are not in control. This need often comes from a deep internal weakness, not strength. Many dictators project confidence, but psychologically, they are often driven by insecurity. They fear humiliation. They fear losing authority. They fear being seen as weak. So they compensate. They dominate harder, punish faster, speak louder, demand loyalty, eliminate opposition. To the public, this can look like strength, but often it is fear wearing a uniform. The dictator's mind works like this: if I lose control, everything collapses. If people question me, they threaten the nation. If I am not feared, I will be destroyed. That is why dictators treat disagreement as betrayal. To them, criticism is not just annoying. It feels existential. Part 2. The narcissism of power. Another major psychological trait found in dictators is narcissism. Not the casual kind people talk about online, but a deeper form of grandiosity. Dictators often believe they are uniquely important. They see themselves as chosen by history. They think normal rules should not apply to them. They crave admiration and become furious when they do not receive it. They do not just want obedience, they want worship. This is why dictators build cults of personality. Their portraits appear everywhere. Their speeches become sacred. Their image is polished, exaggerated, mythologized. The leader is no longer just a politician. He becomes a symbol, a father, a protector, a genius, a legend. Why? Because narcissistic leaders need constant validation. The bigger their inner emptiness, the bigger the public spectacle must become. Mass rallies, giant statues, military parades, dramatic propaganda, carefully staged media appearances. These are not random political choices. They are psychological tools. They feed the dictator's ego and convince the population that resistance is hopeless. Over time, the dictator stops hearing reality. He hears only praise, only filtered information, only loyalty. And when a leader is surrounded only by admiration, delusion becomes easier than self-awareness. Part 3. Paranoia grows with power. One of the most fascinating and terrifying features of dictators is how often they become paranoid. At first, paranoia may help them rise. They are suspicious, strategic, hyper-aware of threats, and willing to assume the worst in people. In unstable political systems, that mindset can actually help a ruthless person survive. But once they gain power, paranoia begins to mutate. They start seeing enemies everywhere. A journalist becomes a threat. A student protest becomes a conspiracy. A joke becomes treason. A former ally becomes a future assassin. The dictator's inner logic becomes increasingly distorted. If they disagree with me, they must be dangerous. If they are silent, they may be planning something. If they praise me too little, they may be disloyal. This is why dictators purge their own inner circle. Not because it is rational, because paranoia eventually consumes trust. Absolute power isolates people, and isolation damages judgment. The dictator becomes trapped in a psychological prison of his own making. He trusts fewer people, receives less truth, fears more betrayal, uses more violence, and that violence creates more enemies, which increases his paranoia even more. It becomes a vicious cycle. Power creates fear. Fear creates repression. Repression creates resistance. Resistance creates more fear. Part 4. Why ordinary people follow dictators. This is the uncomfortable part. Dictators do not rise alone. They need followers. And history shows that ordinary people can support extremely dangerous leaders, not always because they are evil, but because dictators exploit basic human psychology. In times of uncertainty, people crave order. When society feels chaotic, divided, humiliated, or economically broken, many people become psychologically vulnerable to simple answers and strong figures. A dictator offers exactly that. He says, "I alone can fix this. I will restore greatness. I will punish the enemies. I will make life simple again." This message is emotionally powerful because it reduces complexity. People are tired, confused, afraid. The dictator offers clarity, identity, and certainty. He gives them someone to blame, a group to hate, a story to believe, a leader to trust. And once people emotionally invest in that story, many stop thinking critically, because the movement becomes part of their identity. To question the leader would mean questioning themselves. That is why propaganda works so well. It does not just inform people, it reshapes their emotional reality. Part 5. The moral disengagement of dictatorship. For dictators to maintain power, cruelty must become normal. This requires another psychological process, moral disengagement. In simple terms, this means people gradually disconnect their actions from their conscience. Violence becomes security. Censorship becomes protection. Surveillance becomes stability. Brutality becomes necessity. Language is weaponized. The dictator does not say, "I am crushing dissent." He says, "I am defending the nation." He does not say, "I am silencing truth." He says, "I am fighting lies." This matters because humans are easier to manipulate when evil is dressed as virtue. Once the public accepts that repression is moral, almost anything becomes possible. And for the dictator, this is psychologically convenient. He no longer sees himself as cruel. He sees himself as righteous. That is one of the most dangerous transformations in human psychology. When a person becomes convinced that their domination is actually moral. Part 6. Absolute power changes the mind. There is a famous idea that power corrupts, but psychologically, power does something even more specific. It reduces empathy. It weakens self-correction. It inflates confidence. It encourages risk. and it separates people from consequences. The more power a person has, the less often anyone tells them the truth. They stop being challenged, stop being corrected, stop being humanized by equal relationships. And without friction, the ego expands. A dictator begins to confuse personal desire with national destiny. What I want becomes what the country needs. That is why dictators often appear irrational in later stages. They may make disastrous decisions that seem obviously foolish from the outside, but from inside their psychological bubble, those decisions feel justified, because power has distorted reality itself. The dictator no longer lives in the same world as everyone else. He lives in a world of fear, flattery, fantasy, and control. Part 7. The final tragedy of dictators. The tragic irony is this: dictators seek total control because they fear weakness. But the more control they gain, the more fragile they become. Why? Because they destroy the very systems that could have protected them from their own worst impulses. They silence critics who could warn them, punish honesty, reward loyalty over competence, replace truth with propaganda, replace institutions with personal rule. At first, this makes them look powerful, but over time, it makes them dangerously blind. And once a leader cannot hear reality, collapse becomes only a matter of time. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always from the same source: a human mind that chose domination over truth. Closing. So what is the psychology of a dictator? It is insecurity disguised as strength, narcissism disguised as destiny, paranoia disguised as vigilance, cruelty disguised as order, and fear disguised as power. Dictators do not just rule countries. They reshape reality. They poison trust. They turn weakness into spectacle and control into ideology. And the biggest lesson is not that dictators are inhuman. It is that the path to dictatorship begins with very human traits: fear, ego, tribalism, resentment, and the temptation to surrender freedom in exchange for certainty. That is why understanding dictators matters, because the psychology that creates tyranny does not begin at the top. It begins wherever people stop questioning power. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more content on psychology, power, discipline, and the hidden forces that shape human behavior.